The professions have their ethical problems. How might we approach these ethical issues, and how might we develop an analytical perspective to understand these professional ethical problems and envision their resolution? One analytical tool separates out the VCR components of ethical issues. In this analysis, V represents the relevant values and the relevant virtues in the situation. C represents the consequences and contingencies in the situation, and R represents the rights and responsibilities involved. Each of these elements, V, C, and R, are frameworks to use in ethical analysis. Let's sketch an ethical issue in professional life. Let's take the case of a physician considering the purchase of his own diagnostic laboratory. Applying the value part of the values and virtues framework, we ask what are the important values and virtues that affect the physician's decision. The values might be different for different physicians. For some, ownership of the diagnostic clinic could make possible achieving the values of higher levels of quality control and availability of service. For other physicians, ownership of a diagnostic clinic might only realize the values of a higher income for the physician. The virtue part of this framework inquires into the habits and training of the physician in question. Some would be inclined, due to their upbringing, to think primarily of the patient's interest. The clinic in the hands of such a physician would be an asset to the physician and patient alike. In the hands of a physician primarily valuing money, it would benefit the physician at the expense of the patients and society. Recent research has shown that physicians who own clinics both charge more and have a higher percentage of their patients taking their diagnostic tests. The virtue framework analyzes the natural inclinations and dispositions of the physicians involved. Most believe that moral training can modify both inclinations and dispositions. Depending on the values and virtues of the physician, the clinic is an opportunity to serve better or a temptation to profit more. The values and virtues framework focuses on these types of issues. Applying the consequences and contingencies framework, we ask questions about the outcomes of an action, in this case, the results of the physician purchasing the diagnostic clinic. Do the good consequences outweigh the bad consequences? And what are the consequences of buying that clinic? Who are those that bear the consequences of the action? Would someone cause more harm if they purchased the clinic instead of the physician in question? This is an example of the contingencies that affect the actual outcomes. Remember that we never know for certain the consequences of our actions. By focusing on consequences, we see objective evidence of good and bad actions. The intent of the physician is not as important as the actual results. Ethical conflicts can arise when people do not agree whether a certain result is valuable or not. Depending on their own values, the physicians may evaluate their actions differently. The consequences and contingencies framework gives an impersonal and objective criterion for an action. But for those with different values, ethical differences of opinion will persist. The rights and responsibilities analytical framework raises questions about each participant's rights or responsibilities in the situation. What rights and responsibilities do physicians enjoy? Is it their right to profit at the expense of their patients? Or is it their responsibility not to do so? Do the patients have the rights not to be exploited by their physicians? Or the right not to take unnecessary tests? Are there rights that society enjoys if the patient's bills are paid by the public? Rights create correlative responsibilities. If someone has a right to profit, then we have a responsibility to permit it. If someone has a right to privacy, then we have a responsibility to protect it. Identifying all the rights and responsibilities involved in this case leads us to a broader understanding of this important aspect of ethical analysis, the rights and responsibility framework. It is important to understand each of the participants in an ethical decision. We are not alone. Each action involves others, and a knowledgeable ethical judgment is one that is made when we understand all of those involved. We call this stakeholder analysis. Let's consider a middle management internal accountant confronted with the choice of toxic waste disposal company. One company is substantially less expensive than the rest. The manager believes the company may not properly dispose of the waste, but probably will never be caught. The choice will be that manager's alone, but other middle managers would be affected because if one middle manager cheats on their business operations, well, the others are at a disadvantage in peer review, and the actions of one middle manager affect the policies for all. The managers above are affected because if the middle manager's decision is to use the cheap disposal service, the managers above are responsible for the decisions of those below them. The managers below are affected because some of them must actually carry out the deciding manager's decision, and others will know that they may be asked to do a similar work themselves. The entire company will be at risk of being indicted for environmental violation if the middle manager's choice is to improperly dispose of that waste. Outside of the company, suppliers may be affected. Legitimate toxic waste companies would be at a competitive disadvantage. The improperly disposed waste could also harm others. The stockholders and suppliers, the vendors, and the community all have a stake in the success of the company. The manager must make a decision and should consider each stakeholder in that decision. This is the purpose of stakeholder analysis.